Virtual Interactive Notebook 2 for U.S. History B. Title this, Day 6, Victory in the Pacific. The essential question for today, how did the Allies defeat Japan? The main idea is victory in the Pacific. The subtopics are December 7th, 1941, brutal fighting, and island hopping. And today is based on Chapter 27, Section 4. We are going to begin with December 7th, 1941. Leading up to this, Franklin Roosevelt wanted to join the war against Germany, and Japan allied with Germany. Japan was expanding into China, so they became allies of Hitler, which was kind of a strange thing because Hitler wasn't really fond of people who weren't white, but it was an alliance of convenience. So Hitler supported Japan's imperial ambitions in China, and Japan at this time was still buying gasoline from the United States. Franklin Roosevelt thought that we were going to, in fact, you could say he wanted to go to war with Germany, and that also meant Japan. And so he cut off oil sales to Japan. And this was a signal to Japan. They figured that we were prepping to attack them too. They knew that our naval fleet was at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii on a certain day. And so they sent a surprise attack. They thought that if they took out our Pacific fleet all at once, that it would cripple our efforts in the Pacific for years, and we would not be able to hinder their imperial ambitions. So they launched a surprise attack on December 7th, 1941. And they did a lot of damage, but unfortunately for them, our aircraft carriers were out on an exercise. And in this new naval kind of warfare, aircraft carriers were the critical thing. Anyway, for December 7th, 1941, I want you to write, Japan attacks Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. So the United States immediately declared war on Japan and then declared war on Japan's ally Germany, and we are in World War II. For brutal fighting, because of arguably the Code of Bushido, Japanese forces didn't surrender. Now Japan had garrisoned, that means they'd put soldiers in a lot of Pacific islands between Japan and the United States. They were worried that the United States would establish air bases close to Japan on islands and then bomb Japan. As it was, we didn't really have a capability of bombing Japan. Colonel James Doolittle bombed Japan with a couple bombers, but they had to strip him down to do it, and they had to crash land him in China. So Japan was safe from U.S. aerial attack at the beginning of the war, and they wanted to keep it that way. The United States had a Europe first policy, so we put most of our resources into defeating Germany, and only after that did we send well, that's probably oversaid, but the resources going to the Pacific went up after we defeated Germany. But even still, we fought a Pacific campaign. In the early days of the Pacific campaign, Japan took the Philippines, which was an American colony. So for brutal fighting, I want you to write down Bataan Death March. Bataan. The U.S. garrison at Bataan in the Philippines fought until they ran out of ammunition and food, and then they surrendered. And after the surrender, Japan set up concentration camps for captured soldiers. So they force-marched thousands of U.S. and Filipino service personnel, the Filipinos were fighting on our side, to these death camps in what was called the Bataan Death March. And it was absolutely brutal. People who were too slow were shot. Japanese officers... Stupid dog. 1 second. Okay, we're back. So the Japanese force marched them to prison camps, starved them along the way, shot people who were too slow. Japanese officers had samurai swords, and they decapitated people just for the heck of it, because they wanted to use the swords, I guess. And once the prisoners were at these concentration camps, the dying just went on. People starved. And the few who were recovered at the end of World War II looked like people who had done time in Hitler's death camps. So it was pretty bad. The United States destroyed the Japanese fleet, so they came up with a solution to take out American ships. They essentially created anti-ship missiles out of old airplanes. They would train young pilots to minimally fly an airplane, and then they would pack it with gas and explosives, and they would commit suicide running their airplanes into ships. And these were called kamikaze attacks. Kamikaze. Kamikaze means divine wind, and it refers to when the Mongols tried to invade Japan and they were destroyed. Their fleet was destroyed by a storm. So I want two things under brutal fighting: Bataan Death March and Kamikaze. And this takes us to island hopping. So if you imagine Japan over here and the United States over here, and a lot of islands in between, which include places like Guadalcanal, Hawaii, Iwo Jima, places like that, the United States hopped from island to island, getting ever closer to an island that was close enough to Japan to actually bomb it with our heavy bombers. And this all culminated in the Battle of Okinawa. For island hopping, I want you to write Okinawa 1945. Okinawa is spelled Okinawa. And write these figures down. At Okinawa, 17,000 American soldiers and Marines died. 100,000 Japanese soldiers died, which was more or less the whole garrison. 150,000 civilians, people who were not soldiers, died. And a gigantic number of those people killed themselves rather than be captured by the Allies. And this was because of the code of Bushido. There's no surrender. To surrender would dishonor oneself and the emperor. So we have Okinawa 1945, 17,000 Americans, 100,000 Japanese soldiers, 150,000 Japanese civilians. This was very brutal fighting. And I remember when I was a kid, veterans of the Pacific Campaign always, when they remembered their wars, it always more, I don't know, there was something very difficult about it for them there. I remember my Uncle Mac was a veteran of the war in Europe, and he would tell me stories, but my dad knew some guys who were veterans of the Pacific, and they didn't really talk about it a whole lot. So it was very difficult for everybody involved with that. Today's output, I have a video which shows veterans, American veterans going back to Iwo Jima, and they have a message for you, and I want you to write down the 4 most important things that you take from this video for your output. And that will do it. I will see you tomorrow for day 7.